Welcome back to The Breakdown with me, NLW. It's a daily podcast on macro, Bitcoin, and the big picture power shifts remaking our world. What's going on, guys? It is Monday, July 7th, and today we are talking about the mystery of the ancient Bitcoin. Before we get into that, however, if you're enjoying The Breakdown, please go subscribe to it, give it a rating, give it a review, or if you want to dive deeper into the conversation, come join us on the Breakers Discord. You can find a link in the show notes or go to bit.ly/breakdownpod. All right, friends, welcome back from the long holiday weekend, at least for those of you in the US. And over the weekend, we had a fun little mystery come about. While most people were getting ready for 4th of July celebrations the following day, Bitcoiners were watching the chain. A huge quantity of ancient Bitcoin was on the move. Across a series of transactions on Thursday night and into Friday morning, over 80,000 Bitcoin were moved from an ancient wallet cluster. That is around 0.3% of all the Bitcoin that will ever exist. These addresses have been dormant since 2011, so these Bitcoin hadn't been touched in 14 years. At the time, Bitcoin was priced at around $6 a coin. So this represented around $500,000 worth. Small by today's standards, but an insane gamble based on how early things were. The coins were acquired in May of 2011, a few months after the Silk Road launched, but before the Gawker article that made the dark web market notorious. It was also just 5 months after Satoshi's last post, meaning that we are firmly in the earliest era of Bitcoin here. Now, ancient wallets waking up isn't all that unusual, but this is the single largest transaction of its type we've ever witnessed. Coinbase director Connor Grogan traced the coins back to a single miner, who once held 200,000 Bitcoin in a single wallet, one of the largest wallets that has ever existed. Security expert Taylor Monahan noted the strange way the wallets were arranged. Instead of consolidating their coins, this person had split them into multiple 10,000 Bitcoin wallets. That's completely normal now, but in its era, that would be like separating a few $100,000 into $50,000 chunks. Monaghan commented, "The more money you have, the weirder of a practice it becomes. I've never done this, never heard of people doing it, never seen people do it." Although the holdings were relatively large for their time, they are of course completely dwarfed by the $8.6 billion that Bitcoin is worth today. According to Forbes' billionaire list, this is a top 400 personal fortune being moved on-chain in the middle of the night on a national holiday. It was enough to make CZ jealous, with the Binance co-founder tweeting, "I got into crypto too late." One of the first observations was that there was no test transactions. The whale had transferred 10,000 Bitcoin at a time, risking the loss of $1 billion to a typo. The big question, though, was who owned the Bitcoin and why they were moving it after all these years. The natural assumption was that an ancient Bitcoin whale was cashing in. It's a fairly crazy idea to leave 80,000 Bitcoin untouched for 14 years, then one day decide to sell it, but stranger things have happened. However, that doesn't appear to be the case. Once the movement of funds was finished, Arkham Intelligence tweeted, "There are no indications that this whale is selling Bitcoin. The Bitcoin is now sitting in 8 fresh wallets and hasn't moved since Saturday morning." Price movements also suggested no one expected the coins to come to market. In weaker markets, we've seen the price crash when dormant coins wake up, but this time the price didn't move below 107,000. Trader Tyler Neville commented that the entire concept of selling this much Bitcoin in this manner was a little preposterous, tweeting, "If you have $9 billion of any asset, you can't just sell it, FYI. You borrow against assets when you have this much of it. I meant that someone was likely coerced on 4th of July to do this just to see the market reaction. You would move much smaller amounts if you were planning on actually selling it." And yet still, the movement of funds captured the imagination of everyone on crypto Twitter. By the end of the weekend, Connor Grogan had an interesting but admittedly speculative theory, writing, "There is a small possibility that the 8 billion in Bitcoin that recently woke up were hacked or compromised private keys. I found a single BCH test transaction from one of the Bitcoin whale clusters 14 hours ago, followed by the full amount. An hour later, the Bitcoin wallets began to move. There is a possibility that the owner was testing the private key in a way that wouldn't get noticed, as BCH isn't monitored heavily by whale watching services. What makes me say this is the other BCH wallets have not been touched at all. Why wouldn't they also sweep these? This is all extreme speculation, but the movements are extremely odd here. I do not think that this is an exchange wallet due to the BCH activity, and given the Bitcoin transfers appear to be all manual. If true, again I'm speculating on straws here, this would be by far the largest heist in human history. In other words, while this could be a simple case of someone finding their keys after more than a decade, it could also be more nefarious. Alongside the risk of physical or digital theft, some were concerned that this could have been a quantum hack. Quantum computers aren't ready for prime time right now, but the technology is moving fast. To some, it wasn't completely implausible that a research computer could be used to compromise a private key at this stage of the tech. But even if you were willing to entertain that still kind of far out there notion, breaking into 8 wallets in a cluster seems extremely unlikely. In fact, the way that quantum interacts with this could be a little bit simpler. David Hoffman, the co-host of Bankless, tweeted, Old Bitcoin moving from a quantum insecure wallet to a secure one looks identical to a dead wallet getting exploited by a quantum computer. Another angle of the story is that the actual transfer is kind of insane. This wallet predates a lot of the modern systems around Bitcoin security. Back in 2011, there were no 12-word seed phrases. Bitcoin was stored in a local file called wallet.dat. The file could be encrypted, but there was no recovery if the file was lost. Transactions from these old wallets need to be manually constructed and broadcast to the network, adding a few additional points where a billion-dollar typo could be introduced. Block21K wrote, "This wasn't just moving money, it was digital archaeology. They had to preserve an unencrypted file for 14 years, keep it safe from hackers, bit rot, or hardware failure, execute a flawless $8 billion transaction in 2025. Wild." Charles Guillemet, the CTO of Ledger, commented on just how crazy the transaction was, tweeting, "Yesterday, 80,000 Bitcoin worth roughly $8 billion were moved on-chain. These coins date back to 2011, before the BIP39 standard existed. Back then, private keys were managed individually per address with no hardware wallet support, even today. This suggests the keys were stored in a wallet.dat file and the transaction was likely signed using a software wallet like Electrum. From a security standpoint, this is absolutely insane." While the security model is pretty wild, Casa CTO Jameson Lopp is also in the No Test Transactions Club. He commented, "Anyone who understands the UTXO model knows that a transaction completely destroys and then recreates your money. Thus, the idea of a test transaction is laughably naive. Just make sure you verify the transaction details on dedicated hardware." In other words, from all of this, we can assume that this is someone that was deeply into Bitcoin all the way back in 2011. They had dedicated hardware, they maintained a working knowledge of the old methods of transferring Bitcoin, and were ready to put $1 billion on the line. Today's episode of The Breakdown is brought to you exclusively by Grayscale. Grayscale is almost certainly a name you know. They've been offering exposure to crypto for over a decade now and offer over 20 different crypto investment products, ranging from single asset to diversified to thematic exposure to crypto and the broader crypto industry. They have long been innovators at the intersection of TradFi and crypto. And one of the benefits for a lot of us is that Grayscale products are available right through your existing brokerage or IRA. Now, of course, investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. For more information and important disclosures, visit grayscale.com. Go to grayscale.com to explore their full suite of crypto investment products and invest in your share of the future. The big question is, of course, then, who is this? There are really only a small handful of people that fit the description. This wasn't someone who made a small fortune in Bitcoin from the Silk Road era and decided to keep it. Without naming anyone in particular, most of the OGs that are household names today emerged out of 2013. They took a conviction bet that Bitcoin was more than just money for the dark web and built their stacks after the marketplace was shut down. Instead, it looks like someone who was willing to put in a fairly decent sum of the time behind the nascent tech. Some of these addresses have shown up in Bitcoin discussions over the years. One address showed up in a post on Bitcoin Talk in 2021, with a new poster asking for help to recover 10,000 lost Bitcoin. Another two were mentioned in the Craig Wright lawsuit, with the fake Satoshi claiming he owned them but had lost the keys. However, this was an 8-wallet cluster, and none of those documents mentioned the entire group. In a move that will just absolutely shock you, Craig Wright may have just selected some old large wallets from a block explorer. The more reasonable suggestion came from Sonny of TimeChain Index, who wrote, "I'm 99.99% sure it's Roger Ver. Sometime last year, Mr. Hodl was discussing Roger and the potential size of his holdings during a Twitter space. That prompted me to dig into his historical purchase activity. I cross-referenced those dates with my database of unidentified addresses and found only 6 addresses worth 60,000 Bitcoin. Today, all 6 of those addresses moved. In addition, 2 more addresses also moved, ones I had previously missed because they were already labeled as individual X in my system and therefore excluded from my unidentified filters." It's not that much to go on, and Sonny didn't show his work, but this quickly became the dominant theory across crypto Twitter. Now, without getting too deep into Roger Ver's background, he was, of course, one of the earliest Bitcoin evangelists. Prior to 2016, he was sometimes known as Bitcoin Jesus, but had a fall from grace after putting his weight behind the Bitcoin Cash fork. Ver bought large quantities of Bitcoin in 2011 and invested in the earliest Bitcoin companies. That September, he was the major backer of BitInstant, Charlie Shrem's early Bitcoin payments company. When he found Bitcoin in early 2011, Ver was already a reasonably successful businessman through his computer components company, Memory Dealers. One of the wrinkles is that Ver didn't appear to have a ton left in reserve. In 2022, he was named as the reason that CoinFlex, a Bitcoin Cash-focused exchange, was forced to halt withdrawals. The exchange said that Ver, who was also an investor, had failed to meet a $47 million margin call on a leveraged position. Not exactly the behavior you would expect from someone with billions in Bitcoin. Last year, Ver was arrested in Spain for US tax evasion. He's accused of failing to declare 131,000 Bitcoin he owned in 2014 when he renounced his citizenship. The numbers roughly line up, although we don't have a good idea of how many Bitcoin Roger Ver retained from the early days. Udi Wertheimer trolled crypto Twitter by posting a fake Trump tweet claiming Ver had made an 80,000 Bitcoin donation to the US government to clear his issues and obtain the first US Bitcoin visa. Although the post was a joke, Udi commented, "While I have your attention, I don't think there's anything bearish about this. We already knew Roger had a lot of Bitcoin and that he's under the IRS's thumb, so there's basically no new info here. CT traders wouldn't know this, but when whales want to liquidate, they don't just ship 80,000 Bitcoin to Binance and market sell. In fact, if he really wanted to liquidate, the best way to do that would be to seed a new public treasury company and sell shares over time at a 3x premium. And hey, a settlement with the US government isn't off the table either." Of course, the speculation over the weekend was off the charts, so there are a ton of other theories out there as well. Some believe this is the NSA, or the Chinese government, shifting some Bitcoin from a long-forgotten operation. The timeline doesn't really line up for this to be a Chinese miner, with that trend not really beginning until 2013 at the absolute earliest. US intelligence is always a possibility, but without any evidence, it's based on wild speculation alone. Could be that this is part of Trump's government-wide Bitcoin audit. A certain group also read into which tokens moved and which didn't. Whoever this was moved their entire stash, Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, but didn't touch the other forks. Some BSV true believers thought this was a signal, but you could easily justify moving 40 million in Bitcoin Cash and not bothering with 2 million in BSV. Some were thinking about entities that could buy 8 billion of Bitcoin in an over-the-counter deal. GameStop is really the only company that comes to mind with over 6 billion in cash and a mandate to buy Bitcoin. Other more intriguing theories are floating around related to early anonymous Bitcoin miners who have never been revealed. However, those were based on even less evidence, and so make it hard to add all that much to the conversation. Maybe the most remarkable thing about this story then is that we truly have no idea who just moved $8 billion in Bitcoin. Airmass commented, "People have been LARPing for over a decade that Bitcoin is not private, that you need Monero or Zcash, but then somebody sends 8.6 billion and nobody on earth can tell me who it is. Bitcoin isn't private because it hides your transactions. Bitcoin is private because identity is never recorded to begin with. And without identity, all chain analysis boils down to educated guesses, not proof. That said, this is one of the last transactions from an era when being truly anonymous at this size was possible. Sani of TimeChain Index noted that these are the final unlabeled 10,000 Bitcoin wallets he had in his database. There's also the question of how big a deal this is moving forward. While it's a remarkably large amount of Bitcoin coming back online, it's not all that big in the grand scheme of things. Simple Steve tweeted, "Even though it's a lot, moving 14-year-old coins is not all that unusual. It was nothing compared to the amount of 2010 coins we saw moved in 2024. Most on-chain analysts view these movements through the lens of coin days destroyed. This was the second largest spike in the metric ever. Usually a lot of old coins coming online is a very bearish signal, but it's not that simple. We have no indication that the Bitcoin is being sold, and there are, of course, as we've heard, lots of good reasons to upgrade to a modern wallet. The movement also calls into question how much Bitcoin is truly lost. Analysts generally think between 2 and 3 million Bitcoin have been lost forever, but these coins were included in those calculations. Every cycle, early coins wake up and start moving again, so we really have no idea how many are permanently lost. This fact has large implications for how a migration to a quantum-safe Bitcoin protocol should be handled. The idea of marking old coins as abandoned and leaving them behind was always a risky proposition, and this transaction demonstrates why. We may never know who moved these coins or why they moved them. Could end up being a sale, but so far there's no suggestion the ancient whale is going to dump their coins into the order books. In the end, this is one more mystery to be added to the series of Bitcoin myths that have been built up over the years. Not moving the price, it's a mystery without immediate implication, but still some fascinating intrigue. Ultimately, if you are interested in the uniqueness that is this asset and the people around it, the singular fact is that no one knows who just moved $8 billion in Bitcoin. That's going to do it for today's breakdown. Appreciate you listening as always, and until next time, be safe and take care of each other. Peace.